December 1944. Imagine freezing in a foxhole, snow all around, and suddenly chaos explodes. Tanks, bullets, screams. The quiet Ardennes forest turns into a nightmare overnight. Who really saved the day? Which commanders made the right calls, and which ones only thought they did? Was it the reckless genius of Patton, the disciplined American soldiers holding Bastogne, or the ever-confident British Field Marshal Montgomery? And when victory was claimed, who really deserved the credit and who rewrote history to make it their own? Stay with us to the very end of this story, because the answers will shock you. The truth behind the battles, the rivalries, and the pride that shaped the final months of World War II isn't what you've been told. Keep watching. Every decision, every confrontation, every bold move counts. Who won, who lost, and who was just in it for their own glory. The full story is coming. They say war brings out the best and the worst in men. For Bernard Montgomery, it did both. Before the world ever knew his name, he was just another officer in the British Army. Sharp-minded, disciplined, but not exactly loved. Monty wasn't the type to blend in. He stood out in every way, and he liked it that way. To him, command wasn't about popularity. It was about control, precision, results. And that attitude, well, it made him a legend among some and unbearable to others. By the time 1942 rolled around, Britain was bleeding in North Africa. The German Afrika Korps under Rommel, the Desert Fox, was tearing through Allied lines. Morale was crushed. Soldiers were tired, defeated, and it seemed like the sun itself was mocking them, burning hotter with every loss. Then came Montgomery. From the moment he arrived, things changed. Not gradually, not over weeks. Immediately. He walked into command like he'd been waiting his whole life for this stage. He ordered new training schedules, reorganized units, and most of all, demanded absolute discipline. No more sloppy formations, no more half-hearted attacks. He told his men, "You will fight when I say you fight. You will rest when I say you rest. And when the time comes, we will not retreat. We will win." The British troops didn't know what to make of him at first. Some thought he was insane. Others thought he was exactly what they needed. But when the Battle of El Alamein came, everything changed. Monty's plan was simple but brilliant. Hit Rommel hard, keep the pressure constant, and never, ever let the men think of losing. And it worked. When the dust settled, the British had finally stopped Rommel's advance. For the first time in years, they won. Newspapers called him a hero. The people back home loved him. Montgomery was now the man who stopped the Desert Fox. He became a symbol of British pride, the calm, confident commander who brought order out of chaos. But you know what happens when a man becomes a symbol? He starts believing the legend himself. And that's where the Americans come in. When U.S. forces landed in North Africa, they expected cooperation, a partnership between allies. But to Monty, cooperation meant do what I tell you. He saw the Americans as brave but inexperienced. He didn't mean to insult them. Well, maybe he did a little, but his words and actions made it clear who he thought was in charge. Meet General Eisenhower. Calm, diplomatic, the perfect politician general. He wanted unity, coordination, respect between forces. Then there was Patton, bold, loud, aggressive, the kind of man who led from the front and cursed like a storm. And between them was Montgomery, calculated, rigid, impossible to ignore. From day one, the friction was there. The Americans thought Monty was arrogant, that he dismissed their opinions and took all the credit. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Monty loved the spotlight. He'd hold press conferences where he'd say things like, "We're going to destroy the enemy," utterly before the operations even began. To the Americans, that was reckless. To Monty, it was morale building. But here's the thing about morale. It's powerful and it's dangerous when mixed with ego. Every time the British made a move that worked, Monty would praise his men, but also himself. Every time something went wrong, he'd find a way to make it sound like someone else hadn't followed his brilliant plan. By early 1943, whispers were spreading through American ranks. "Who does this guy think he is?" they'd say. "Why does he act like we're just his sidekicks?" Eisenhower tried to calm things down, to remind everyone that the enemy was Germany, not each other. But even he couldn't fully smooth over the tension. Monty wasn't trying to start a feud. He genuinely believed his way was the right way. He didn't care about politics or egos, only about winning. But the Americans cared about respect, and Monty's sharp, dismissive tone cut deep. Then came Sicily. Operation Husky, July 1943. The Allies were about to invade Europe for the first time, and Montgomery wanted the spotlight again. His plan was ambitious, bold, and in his mind, flawless. He wanted his British forces to lead the main assault, with the Americans providing support on the flanks. Patton? Yeah, that didn't sit well with him. He wasn't the type of guy who liked supporting roles. He wanted action, victory, and headlines. When Montgomery's cautious plans slowed things down, Patton just moved faster. He broke through enemy lines, charged west, and captured Palermo before Monty could even reposition. And guess what? The headline screamed, "Patton takes Palermo." To Monty, that was infuriating. He saw it as reckless, disobedient. To Patton, it was war done right. The rivalry wasn't just tactical anymore, it was personal. By late 1942, Montgomery wasn't just another British general. He was the British general. After El Alamein, people were calling him the man who turned the war around. Newspapers painted him like some kind of saint in uniform, the savior of the British Army. But if you ask the Americans, they weren't exactly throwing a party in his honor. See, Monty had this way about him. He didn't just want to win. He wanted everyone to know he was the reason they won. He strutted into Allied meetings like he owned the room, arms crossed, chin high, and that trademark black tilted just enough to say, "I'm not just in command, I'm in control." At first, the Yanks tried to laugh it off. Eisenhower, good old Ike, was a diplomat by nature. He'd smile, nod, smooth things over, but even his patience had limits. Monty's confidence wasn't quiet, it was loud. It filled the air. And to Americans, that confidence sounded a lot like arrogance. In one briefing before D-Day, Montgomery spread a massive map across the table, pointed at the beaches of Normandy, and started explaining his plan for the invasion, as if the U.S. generals in the room hadn't spent months planning it themselves. "You see, gentlemen," he said in that clipped British tone, "once my forces secure the lodgment, your divisions will move here and here under my operational control." The room went silent. The Americans just stared at him, because here was this British general, commanding American troops, as if their presence was just another extension of his plan. It didn't help that Monty had a knack for talking down to people, like he was a schoolteacher correcting a group of slow students. Bradley hated it. Patton despised it. Even Eisenhower, who tried to play the peacekeeper, found himself gritting his teeth. Montgomery wasn't trying to be insulting, at least not intentionally. In his mind, he was just right, and everyone else needed to catch up. But the Americans had their pride too. They'd bled in Africa, they'd fought in Sicily. They weren't about to let some British officer take all the glory. Behind closed doors, the jokes started flying. Monty's idea of cooperation, Patton said, is when you do what Monty wants. And yet, here's the twist. For all his arrogance, Montgomery got results. His men trusted him. He planned meticulously, every movement, every shell, every mile. He hated unnecessary casualties, and he genuinely believed that if soldiers were going to die, it better be for something that mattered. That's what made him a hero in Britain and a thorn in the side of every American general he worked with. But as the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, the fragile alliance started to shake. Montgomery wanted the whole operation under a single unified command, his command. He said it was for efficiency, but to the Americans, it sounded like a British power grab. By the time they reached the River Seine, the tension was no longer hidden. Bradley wrote in his diary that Monty talks cooperation but means domination. Patton called him a prima donna. And Eisenhower? He just sighed and said, "If only Monty could keep his mouth shut, he might be the best soldier we have." But of course, Monty never kept his mouth shut. By September 1944, Montgomery thought he saw his chance, a chance to end the war by Christmas. The Germans were retreating, their lines were stretched thin, and Monty, ever the showman, came up with a plan so bold it almost sounded insane. He called it Operation Market Garden. The idea? Drop thousands of paratroopers behind enemy lines across the Netherlands, capture a series of key bridges, and open a clear road straight into the heart of Germany. If it worked, the war could end months early. If it failed, well, Monty didn't like to talk about failure. At the Allied headquarters, the Americans sat around the table listening to him lay it all out, his hands cutting through the air like a conductor leading an orchestra. He promised it'd be swift, decisive, historic. Eisenhower hesitated. Bradley frowned. Patton nearly rolled his eyes clean out of his head, but Montgomery had confidence like gravity. You couldn't escape it. So Ike gave him the go-ahead. "All right, Monty," he said quietly. "It's your show." And so, on September 17th, 1944, the sky above Holland filled with parachutes, tens of thousands of Allied troops descending from the clouds. It was one of the most ambitious airborne operations in history. The first few hours looked promising. Bridges were taken, roads secured, but then everything began to unravel. The drop zones were too far apart. Communication broke down. German forces, thought to be in retreat, turned out to include SS Panzer divisions regrouping nearby. The British 1st Airborne found themselves trapped in Arnhem, surrounded, cut off, and outgunned. As reports came in, Montgomery refused to believe it. He kept insisting things were under control, but they weren't. Arnhem turned into a nightmare. Street by street, the paratroopers fought until they were nearly wiped out. Of the 10,000 men who landed there, less than 2,000 made it back. When the operation collapsed, the Americans were furious. Patton slammed his fist on the table. Bradley muttered, "We could have been across the Rhine if we'd followed my plan." And Monty, he held a press conference and called Market Garden a 90% success. That was it. That was the moment the Americans truly turned on him. They couldn't believe the arrogance. To watch thousands of men die, to see the operation fall apart and still spin it like a victory. To them, it wasn't leadership. It was ego. But Monty didn't flinch. In his mind, history would remember results, not politics. He told his staff, "The Americans are amateurs in war. They win by numbers, not by brains." That line, whether he meant it or not, spread through the ranks like wildfire. From that moment, the partnership cracked. Eisenhower stopped inviting Monty to some high-level meetings. Patton refused to coordinate directly with him. And the soldiers on the ground, they started to whisper, "Why is that British guy always acting like he's running the whole damn war?" The thing about Montgomery was, he wasn't evil. He wasn't even wrong most of the time. He just didn't understand people. He understood battle plans, logistics, discipline, but not egos, not pride, not the fragile dance of Allied cooperation. And by the winter of '44, when the Germans launched their last desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge, that misunderstanding would come back to haunt him. December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes were quiet, too quiet. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, covering tanks, helmets, even bodies. American soldiers, half frozen in their foxholes, thought the war was nearly over. Then, before dawn, the silence shattered. Artillery thundered. The Germans had returned. Hitler had thrown everything he had left into one final gamble, a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes. The aim: split the Allied line, capture Antwerp, and force a truce on his terms. For days, the U.S. divisions, surprised, surrounded, cut off, fought desperately just to stay alive. Bastogne. That name would be carved into history. The 101st Airborne held the town against overwhelming odds, while Patton, reckless, brilliant Patton, turned his entire army 90 degrees and drove north through the snow to save them. It was chaos, confusion, heroism, and right in the middle of it all, Montgomery. See, when the Germans hit, the northern Allied flank collapsed. Montgomery's sector suddenly stretched from the North Sea all the way down to the American front lines. He took command of several U.S. divisions to stabilize the defense, which, in military terms, made sense. But in political terms, oh boy, it was gasoline on fire. Because once the crisis passed, Montgomery called a press conference. He stood before the cameras, neat uniform, beret sharp as ever, and said with that calm British confidence that he had taken control of the Northern Front, he had organized the defense, and he had saved the Americans from disaster. You can imagine how that went down. In the U.S. camps, fury spread like wildfire. Patton almost exploded. Bradley was livid. Eisenhower, usually calm, always diplomatic, was so angry he nearly had Monty removed from command altogether. Patton stormed into Ike's office and said, "Let's kick that British son of a bitch back across the channel." Bradley added, "The only thing Montgomery ever saved was his own reputation." Now, to be fair, Monty had helped. He did bring order to the chaos in the north, but his biggest enemy wasn't the Germans anymore. It was his mouth. Every time he opened it, he managed to insult the very people keeping him in power. After the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower tried one last time to make peace. He invited Montgomery to his headquarters, sat him down, and said, "Bernard, we both want the same thing, like to win this war. But you've got to stop making it about you." Montgomery nodded politely. He promised he'd tone down the publicity. And then, the next week, he gave another interview calling himself the architect of Allied victory in the West. It was hopeless. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine and rolled into Germany, Montgomery's star had started to fade. He was still respected, even admired for his discipline, his precise planning, his refusal to waste lives. But among the Americans, he'd become a symbol of British arrogance. A man too proud to share credit, too blunt to play politics, too stubborn to change. When the war ended, and Eisenhower stood surrounded by his generals, Bradley, Patton, Montgomery, the cameras flashed, capturing the men who'd brought down Hitler's empire. But behind those smiles, the tension was still there. They'd fought the same enemy, but they never truly fought together. Years later, when asked what he thought of the Americans, Montgomery said, "They were brave, determined, and full of confidence, but they lacked discipline." When asked what the Americans thought of him, Patton's old staff officer just smirked and said, "They thought he was brilliant and insufferable." The truth is, Montgomery wasn't hated because he was British or because he was wrong. He was hated because he was Montgomery. Too smart for his own good, too proud to admit mistakes, too convinced that victory had one name, his. And yet, without him, the British Army might never have stood tall again after the disasters of 40 and 41. He gave them something they'd lost, belief. And for all the resentment, even the Americans had to admit the man could win battles. Maybe that's the real legacy of Bernard Montgomery, a man who led with logic but lost with words, who built victories on the field and burned bridges off it. A hero to his men, a headache to his allies, and a name history will never forget. Spring 1945. Germany was collapsing like a house of cards in a windstorm. The Americans were tearing through the heart of the Reich, unstoppable, fueled by tanks, trucks, and sheer grit. Patton's Third Army was practically running over towns, liberating villages, while Bradley's men coordinated a relentless push from the north. And somewhere in all this chaos, Monty, still sharp as a tack, still planning, still Monty. By now, the war was basically an American show, with British units filling in the gaps, holding lines, guarding flanks. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was professional, yes. Disciplined, yes. But the days of Monty calling the shots for the entire front were over. Every move had to be coordinated with Ike and the American juggernaut. And you could see it on his face. The man who loved control, who thrived on being the smartest in the room, suddenly had to share that room. Of course, Monty didn't like it one bit. He still had opinions. Endless opinions about how Bradley should move his forces, how Patton should slow down and be methodical. The Americans, tired, battle-hardened, and confident, mostly ignored him, and that drove him crazy. There was one last big moment, though, before Germany fell completely. The Americans wanted to take Berlin fast, smash through what was left of the German army, and end the nightmare. Monty? He had a plan, naturally. A precise, perfectly organized plan that would have, in his mind, minimized casualties and maximized glory. Problem was, the Americans didn't need a plan. They had momentum, experience, and enough firepower to make the rules irrelevant. So Monty watched. He advised, he complained, he wrote notes, he gave interviews, and he waited. And when May 8th came and the Germans finally surrendered, it wasn't Monty standing in the middle of Berlin with a victorious smile. It was Ike, Patton, Bradley, the Americans who had carried the final punch. Monty was there, nodding, crisp uniform, medals shining, claiming quietly in his head that yes, he had helped. But history, the cameras, the newspapers, the post-war books would remember something a little different. Montgomery would go on, after the war, to write memoirs, give speeches, argue that the Allies owed their victories to his foresight, his planning, his brilliance. Ike ignored it. Bradley documented the real story. Patton, well, he was gone by then, but his diary made sure the record was clear. Monty, as brilliant as he was, had a way of turning other people's hard work into a supporting role for his ego. And yet, despite all that, you couldn't say he didn't have talent. Every man under his command knew it. Every operation he touched had that Monty stamp. Meticulous, careful, sometimes painfully slow but effective. He could win battles, he could save lives, but sharing credit, that was the impossible part. So that's the story of the final months in Europe, with Monty, the Americans, the chaos, the glory, and the grudges. The war ended and the world moved on. But anyone who'd been there, in the mud, the snow, the towns lit on fire, remembered the man who could command, who could calculate, who could organize a miracle, and still somehow make you hate him. After Germany started to crumble, the Allies weren't done yet. There were pockets of resistance, towns still holding out, snipers hiding in ruined buildings. Patton's men were sweeping through Bavaria, Bradley was pushing across the northern plains, and Monty was still everywhere at once. Inspecting, directing, rewriting maps, sipping tea while chaos raged around him. One story that stuck was a small village near the Rhine. American troops had been pinned down by a stubborn German garrison, artillery shells falling like hail. Monty arrived in his car, orderly, calm, surveying the battlefield like it was a chessboard. He gave orders that were technically correct, but painfully slow. The Americans, used to improvising under fire, grumbled. "Here comes the guy with a plan," one soldier muttered. "Let's hope it doesn't get us all killed waiting." And sure enough, by the time Monty's reinforcements lined up perfectly, the Americans had already stormed the village, capturing it on their own terms. Monty nodded, made notes, and told reporters later that his strategy had been crucial. Meanwhile, there were tense moments behind the scenes. Even in victory, Monty couldn't help himself. He would send memos to Ike, pointing out flaws in American strategy, suggesting alternative routes, or criticizing supply decisions. Bradley and Patton read them, groaned, then moved on. "He's like a bloody cat with 9 lives, one officer joked. Always landing on his feet, always making it about him. But Monty's presence wasn't all bad. His careful planning did save lives on more than one occasion. Convoys avoided ambushes because he had mapped them out. Reinforcements arrived exactly when needed. And when German snipers targeted towns, Monty's insistence on cautious advance prevented unnecessary American casualties. So the soldiers might complain, the generals might groan, but deep down they knew he had value, just too much ego to handle. By late April, the Allies were closing in on the final German positions. Patton was racing through central Germany, Bradley securing the north, and Monty was pushing his group into the northwestern cities. Always meticulously organized, always precise. The Americans would outpace him at nearly every turn, but Monty insisted on marching in step with the rules, making sure every unit was accounted for, every road clear, every artillery position mapped. And then came the final days. Berlin was surrounded, Hitler's regime collapsing, and the war could finally be called over. Monty, for all his grand plans, couldn't dictate the final victory. The Americans had the speed, the manpower, the tanks, the air support. All he could do was coordinate, observe, and remind everyone how much the British Army had done and how smart he'd been all along. When the surrender came, Monty shook hands with the Americans, posed for photos, gave interviews, and as always, he framed it as a victory he had helped engineer, downplaying the fact that the Americans had done most of the heavy lifting. Yet, in private, even he had to admit that the war had shifted. American industrial power, their sheer numbers, their boldness, that was the engine of victory. And no amount of planning could change that. But Monty didn't let it get to his head. Too much. He still believed he had made the difference, still wrote notes to himself, still plotted for future campaigns, still the same man who wanted control, respect, and recognition. The Americans, meanwhile, went home, celebrated, wrote their memoirs, and grumbled about the British field marshal who had been brilliant, careful, and impossible. And that's how it ended. Germany defeated, Europe liberated, Monty still Monty. The war was over, but the grudges, the stories, the lessons, the jokes, they lasted far longer. Every American soldier who had fought with him remembered the man who could command, could plan, could win, but who also never quite understood that winning sometimes meant letting others shine. After the dust settled across Germany, the Allies weren't just celebrating victory. They were grappling with the aftermath. Towns lay in ruins, railways destroyed, civilians terrified, and soldiers bone-weary. Patton's Third Army pressed east, Bradley coordinated occupation zones, and Monty was still inspecting, measuring, planning, and taking notes as if the war were far from over. He'd walk through towns, pointing out where defenses could have been stronger, where his forces might have done better, and how next time everything would run like clockwork. The Americans couldn't decide whether to laugh or groan. "Here comes the general who wants to keep fighting a war that's already over," one sergeant muttered. Monty's obsession with order did have its moments. He prevented looting, organized medical care, and ensured displaced civilians weren't completely ignored. Still, his presence grated on the Americans, who were used to improvising, taking initiative, and making split-second decisions. Monty's methodical approach, while safe and effective on paper, often slowed things down. Patton had already mentally taken Berlin. Monty wanted a detailed map, a committee, and a 10-page report before stepping into any building. Meanwhile, political tensions simmered. Eisenhower had to juggle Monty's ego, the Americans' complaints, and delicate relations with French, Belgian, and Dutch authorities trying to rebuild. Every press release Monty gave added fuel to the fire. "I coordinated the Northern Front," he'd say. The British Army executed brilliant maneuvers. American faces would turn red. Privately, they'd agree Monty was brilliant, but insufferable, self-centered, and impossible to share the spotlight with. Despite all this, Monty had his admirers. British troops respected his discipline and marveled at his ability to inspire confidence amid chaos. "He's a genius," they'd whisper. "But bloody hell, he thinks the sun rises and sets on him." The Americans, meanwhile, were learning a harsher lesson. Winning battles is one thing. Winning the trust and respect of allies is another. Monty excelled at the first and failed at the second. By May 1945, the war in Europe was officially over. German troops had surrendered. Cities were liberated and soldiers were heading home. Monty organized parades, ceremonies, and award presentations. He ensured British contributions were highlighted, always placing himself at the center of the photos. Americans were present, of course, but Monty's camera-ready style framed the narrative as if the British had steered the final victory. In reality, the Americans had done the heavy lifting, faced the risks, and paid the price. Monty had provided stability, logistics, and planning, essential, yes, but the Americans had pushed forward with guts, speed, and determination. Monty never saw it that way. In his memoirs years later, he wrote of the decisive British leadership that guided the final push into Germany. He critiqued Eisenhower's decisions, praised his own strategy, and subtly implied that without him, the Allies might have faltered. American generals reading those memoirs rolled their eyes. They knew the man's brilliance, but they also knew his stubbornness, his inability to share credit, and his talent for turning events into a personal narrative. And so the legacy of the war became a complicated tapestry. Soldiers remembered courage, teamwork, and blood spilled on frozen fields. Historians debated strategies and who truly deserved credit. Montgomery remained a figure both respected and reviled, a man whose tactical genius was undeniable, whose political and social awareness were limited, and whose ego often overshadowed his accomplishments. For the Americans, veterans, and generals alike, the lesson was clear. In coalition warfare, human respect matters as much as military skill, and arrogance can be as dangerous as any enemy. And so, the story of Bernard Montgomery comes to a close, not with fireworks or a single defining moment, but with the quiet truth of a man both brilliant and flawed. A soldier who could plan with unmatched precision, inspire unwavering loyalty, and win battles that seemed impossible, yet struggle endlessly with the human side of leadership. Monty reminds us that even the greatest minds carry imperfections, that courage and discipline don't always come wrapped in humility, and that history remembers results even if grudges linger in the shadows. If there's one lesson to take from Montgomery's life, it's this. Mastery over a task, skill in your craft, and drive to succeed can move mountains. But true greatness is measured not only by what you achieve, but by how you respect, trust, and lift those around you along the way. In war, in life, in every challenge you face, be bold, be disciplined, but never forget the people who fight beside you. That is how legacies endure.